We are almost ready to start the event. Friends, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here in the Diplomatic Academy of Ukraine. And today, the idea of this event is to discuss one of the most important issues in diplomacy, diplomacy of resistance and resilience, and how to preserve the world order. And this event will be conducted today in partnership with our long-standing great partners, namely the Council of Foreign Policy, Foreign Prism, and the representative office of the Frederick Ebert Foundation in Ukraine. So, strategic analysis, international expertise, support of democracy worldwide are all the extremely important topics, especially in the time when the international law, the basic rules of security and respect to sovereignty become of paramount importance, being under unprecedented attack. Here today we will be not only discussing those topics, but also hopefully come up with some ideas which would help to rethink the democracy as the tool of influence, solidarity, and long-term resilience. And the Ukrainian experience in this context becomes, I would even call it unique, because it already starts shaping new approaches to international relations, to security alliances, and the responsibilities of the states in the face of the trends in international community. So the task for us, politicians, diplomats, activists, is not only to resist the aggression, but also to discuss the world order that should be centered around human rights, respect, and I wish all of the participants of this event deep discussions, sound conclusions, and new strategic solutions. So, thank you for being here, thank you for caring, and glory to Ukraine, glory to its heroes. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, Your Excellencies, my name is Serhiy Gerasimchuk. I'm Deputy Acting Director of Prism Center, presenting our outline of foreign policy trends. And let me start by saying this year, Ukrainian Prism will celebrate 10 years of our existence. All through those 10 years, we had obviously ups and downs, facing tremendous problems, especially early 2022, when actually everybody here was facing an existential challenge to existence. But all through those 10 years, Ukrainian Prism tried to demonstrate resistance and resilience. 10 years of expertise and research followed up that all through those 10 years we have been providing everyone with our foreign policy scorecards. And the scorecards, they suggest that we went through turbulent times, again, like I said, ups and downs, along with the whole country. And right now we are entering the stage of even higher turbulence, the type of turbulence when a lot would depend on the capacities, ability, resilience, and resistance. 10 years. In this research, along with us, we were lucky to have experts from the Frederick Ebert Foundation, a great partnership indeed, because all of you who know how donors operate, how the civic society operates, 10 years of partnership, you understand, is worth a lot, and we're grateful to our German partners for being with us all through those turbulent 10 years of time. 10 years of time for the country is both a lot, but at the same time 10 years could be also viewed as just the beginning of something bigger and brighter. But again, it's 10 years that we are trying to help our foreign ministry, all our colleagues in the parliamentary committees, in the government, in the office of the Vice Prime Minister in charge of Euro-Atlantic integration, and all through those 10 years, even though every year, year in, year out, the assessments differed, but the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, the parliamentary committees, ministries and agencies, central executive bodies and authorities, they all demonstrated the needed resistance and resilience. Summing up, and passing the floor to the next keynote speaker, let me just tell you that 10 years of being in the focal point of our diplomatic community and also how we represent Ukraine in the United Nations. And it's my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Kislitsa with his opening remarks. Good morning, esteemed ladies and gentlemen. My job is to read the welcoming speech of Foreign Minister Sybiga, who until yesterday night planned to be here, but probably you read in the news that he just came to Paris as part of the Ukrainian delegation to be in the French capital to conduct the meeting with the Coalition of the Willing. So the willing could be translated differently, of course. So, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of diplomatic and media communities, here in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we focus a lot on involving experts and focusing on expert diplomacy at large, because it proves to be quite a productive partnership that we value a lot and strive to evolve. We are grateful to the Ukrainian Prism and to the representative office of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Ukraine. This is the 10th annual analysis of foreign policy, a systemic one, I hope, deep and comprehensive. So I'm grateful to all of you and all the experts who were instrumentally involved in, well, I made Freud-like misspelling. So all the inputs were quite meaningful and timely to help strengthen the Ukrainian diplomacy. And that's what we're working on 24/7, 365 days a year in the ministry. This is the reality of the country that fights against the Russian imperialism and genocidal aggression. These are the realities of Ukraine that carries out the existential fight for the right to live, the right for sovereignty, and for the lasting and fair peace. Here in Ukraine, the world order is being decided for dozens of years to come. It's Ukraine that helps to set the new architecture of security in Europe, together with allies and partners, all of the people of goodwill. Dear friends, I wish all of us vivid and fruitful discussions. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs is always open to your recommendations and ideas, so that together we'll be able to implement them in the Ukrainian vested national interests using the available foreign policy tools. Today we have no right to get tired. No, vice versa. We need to focus even more and spare no efforts to fight for the Ukrainian interests by gaining fair peace, with no compromises on sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Strong Ukrainian army, bringing all the Ukrainian prisoners of war and stolen children back home, persecuting the criminals, including the top management of the aggressor country, the membership of Ukraine in the EU and NATO, the protection of Ukrainians abroad and bringing them back home, so that all of us together would be able to rebuild the dear Ukraine. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to its heroes. And let me add on a personal note that today is an important day in the history of modern Ukraine. Back in 1991, on this day, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, the Parliament of Ukraine, has passed the law on rehabilitation of the victims of political repressions. I'm not sure why it happened on the April the 17th, but today is also the 87th anniversary of the tragedy of 1938, when in Simferopol KGB prison there was a fact of mass shooting of the elite of Crimean Tatar people. They were all shot dead by the shooting squad that was flown in from Moscow. The court session lasted for 20 minutes, and then dozens of Crimean Tatar elites were sentenced to death and ultimately shot by this shooting squad. So the history of the Crimean Tatar people has those tragic pages in its history, and that's also one of our goals, to support and protect not only the interests of the Crimea as a peninsula, but of its indigenous people of Crimean Tatars. So we need to remember about the victims of Crimean Tatar people, the victims of the whole of Ukrainian people who died in the 30s, then 40s, all the way to modern days Russian Federation's aggression. And I'm grateful to Suspilne TV that printed a very great article about this tragedy in Crimea. I just want to read out loud the words of Gulnar Abdullaeva, a historian, who said, "The memory about those shot dead is not only the reason for us to feel sadness, but it's the way for us to bring back their names, the songs, the places they lived in, the memory about the Ukrainians killed in this war also should not be filled only with sadness. It has to be the source of inspiration for us to become stronger. And we need to remember about those victims. And I'm grateful to all of you for being here with us today. I have mentioned the role of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation that supports this project for 10 years. Unfortunately, Felix Het, the director of the representative office, is in Tbilisi today, but still he would make a video address to all of us. Високоповажності.
Ladies, it is a great honor to address you today on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Ukraine. I regret not being able to join you in Kiev in person for this important occasion, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to share a few words. This year marks the 10th edition of the Ukrainian Foreign Policy Scorecards, an analytical milestone that reflects both the resilience and strategic depth of Ukraine's diplomacy. We are proud to continue our long-standing and trusted partnership with Ukrainian Prism, whose dedication and professionalism have made this annual assessment a key reference point for understanding Ukraine's international engagement. In 2024, Ukraine once again demonstrated remarkable diplomatic resolve. Amid an ongoing war of aggression, Ukrainian foreign policy actors, from the President and Parliament to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also mentioning the civil society here, sustained high-level engagement, the comprehensive scope and rigorous methodology of the scorecards make visible the nuanced efforts behind every strategic relationship, every multilateral initiative, and every coalition built for peace and recovery. The continued over-rating is not only a reflection of performance, it is a testament to consistency, maturity, and a vision-driven approach to foreign policy, qualities that are all the more admirable in the context of war. As a foundation committed to supporting democratic resilience and European integration, we deeply value the insights that this publication offers. We also value the open and constructive cooperation we enjoy with both civil society and public institutions in Ukraine, cooperation that will remain essential in the years ahead. I wish you fruitful discussions today and continued strength in advancing Ukraine's foreign policy goals. The Friedrich Ebert Stiftung remains a steadfast partner on this journey. Thank you very much.
Ну і оскільки сьогодні ми
And since we are bringing up this 10 years anniversary of our partnership with the foundation, well, thousands of articles and comments, and we have beautiful Gadna Shalis as the editor of this publication, so I would kindly ask her to start presenting the results of this year's research and as well as share her personal take on what it takes to be involved in this for 10 straight years.
Good afternoon, dear all. We will put the brief on the screen. So the most of things that you've got from materials, we should be clear that 320 pages hardly can cope in one go. So we'll focus on the most critical and important things which we had came to as a result of 2024 engagement. First of all, at the beginning, we have to do some generic remarks to be clear for future. These are the issues on which we are dealing for all 10 years. We, in Ukrainian Prism, do not assess the work of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We evaluate the entire foreign policy of Ukraine, all actors and stakeholders. Although the major burden sits with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that's obviously, but the peculiarity is we understand that in the given circumstances, the foreign policy is far more broader. So the overall assessment is based on the presidential office, parliamentary diplomacy efforts, individual ministries and other governmental departments from culture up to defense, if they were engaged in any extent in any foreign activities. So that's the first. Secondly, we do not assess bilateral relations. I mean, we evaluate activity of Ukraine, to what extent we were proactive or passive, efficient or effective. Sometimes the results are affected seriously by the counterparts, how the responses were implemented, to what extent our initiatives were implemented or not. But it is clear and obvious, and you will see the respective remarks in the text, the assessment would be based on Ukrainian efforts, to what extent we succeeded, to what extent we were strategic in our aspirations. And of course, we will start with methodology. Hardly we can avoid that. Just to be clear what we are talking about, 47 directions for this year, 2 directions less. As usual, we reshaped slightly. You would not see Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia separately. They were combined as a Baltic states bloc. due to their comprehensive and unified approach to Ukraine. But for the first time, you can spot Mexico, because the efforts in that direction were activated. You would not see the human rights bloc, which was available last year. One of the reasons why the respective authorities decided so, because relations with many nations, either in peace formula or anything else, they still would be related to a foreign policy, but not to an extent that the special commissioner or other governmental departments' engagement. You would not spot Iran. We kept this state for many years, although you would see Russia and Belarus. Russia and Belarus would not have their scores. Again, that's decision been made deliberately. We either can describe our activities, but to assess activities and results in comparison with the enemy states and friendly states with whom we would like to have a stable dialogue, that would be irrelevant and no logic in that. A different methodology would be required for that. Same as this year that had happened to Iran, we decided that it would be improper to assess activity which is not there because there is no relations of Iran engagement at foreign policy. Although we got the peace formula as a separate block, we argued for quite a while whether it should be presented in a separate block. Nevertheless, quite many efforts and resources were allocated to that particular direction, and we decided it deserves to be even temporarily included as a separate block. We have bilateral relations, we have international organizations, and we have multilateral tracks where separate economic diplomacy, public diplomacy, military diplomacy, energy diplomacy is present. Something that can be traced clearly and assessed and scored accordingly. And in comparison, we have B+ overall score. We believe in the current conditions this is a very well score, very good score. Speaking about points, those who are very keen getting into all the figures and details, we keep that at the end, and I will give you a hint. That's the page 308. Everything has been calculated up to after comma, so the score has been changed slightly, but overall it's B+. Or those who attended the school in the previous years, it's 4+ or 90 points, but that's the overall score which we are based at. As usual, we have some issues related to the outcomes of some individual countries, but as far as this is the mathematics and calculations to maintain the objectivity, unfortunately, some of the countries failed to get their biggest score, but affected the overall outcome. So indicators which we evaluate against, and you will see the outcomes of that 3 years when we reviewed our methodology to meet the modern challenges. So we assess the political interest. How do we see that region? How clear are we with our interests? How often and what president and prime minister and ministers speak about this nation? Is that in interviews? Are there speeches? Whether there were visits? So engagement and political interest of all the stakeholders. Quite challenging element, but it's clear, especially in the previous years, and we compare that for 10 years, and we had cases when attitude was changing radically between the cabinet of ministers and presidential office, and this disbalance affected seriously on the assessment of political interest. For last 3 years, we assessed strategic communications separately. That's a comprehensive, challenging parameter. While we may say that bilateral relations, it's about interviews, media appearance, parliament speeches or international conferences, we speak narratives, messages, whether they were separate campaigns, because we know that there were some campaigns on certain directions, and results goes without saying. We have that. And what we end up with. So the outcomes and scores, I hardly can cover all the nations and states, but to have an overall understanding what we're talking about, as usual, the best score has been achieved by G7, group of 7. We have certain improvements, including the political interest that Ukraine demonstrates, although there are some diseases. Canada, for instance, received a bit lower score in comparison to the previous year because of the changes of these first two indicators, political interest and strategic communications. Nevertheless, we have in the recent 2 years the improvements with Japan. We see active engagement in that direction. Same goes to United Kingdom, where we keep the stable score. And the same, we had a bit reduced score for the United States of America. And that is the example when our active engagement and strategic communication failed to provide the fully expected result. We all understand that it relates to the election campaign and the processes has happened in the spring in Congress, but fact is the fact. There were purposes stated which were not achieved to full extent. So this year you will see the changes in the score from A- to B+. European Euro-Atlantic integration, as usual, perfect. Last year does not require deliberate announcements. We all may welcome the completion of screening and launching of negotiations with EU. Maybe not to an extent the formal, but nevertheless is something more than the next step. Introduction of the first working groups, so activities within Ukraine and externally was on top. European integration improved their score from B to A-, although we have not received changes in formulations in Washington summit, which we dreamed of. Nevertheless, it has been improved because of strategic communications and the first parameter. Unlike previous year, we have received a clear formulation that NATO membership is unchangeable. It is not going to be the subject for negotiations with Russia, and signing strategic bilateral agreements is not the alternative to NATO membership. So, as a result, improvement of strategic communication and comprehensiveness improved the overall results. Bilateral relations, the most difficult to see because of this excessive list, which is quite large. So the top is traditional to an extent. We speak about our relations with neighbors, first of all, Poland and Czech Republic. Moreover, Poland improved the score in comparison to the previous year, which is an important step forward. We have relatively positive results demonstrated with Turkey, with Australia, Moldova, where we saw more activities and more results. Unfortunately, we have the states where our score has been decreased, but that's what we have. That's Israel, where we can see the most significant change in the scores. But again, that's the result which we stress on constantly. That is a comprehensive outcome. There was some Ukrainian pause in dialogue with Israel, but also due to the objective situation, the aggravation of situation in Gaza and Israeli-Lebanese conflict. We have assessed Mexico for a first time. Maybe it's not the highest score, but nevertheless, we managed to get additional country for review. It means that we have a serious agenda growing. A number of delegations had visited Mexico and allowing us to introduce this country for our analysis and see what's going to happen. Then, what we also can mention, that's a slight improvement in relations with China. Accordingly, we say that China had received this score because of activities and engagements. We have not achieved the expected outcome, but the foreign minister's visit, there was a significant step forward in comparison to the previous years. And a significant step forward had happened with India, quite fair, keeping in mind that from C to A minus, that's a tremendous gap. But last year was full of bilateral contacts at different levels. And for the first in 30 years, maybe 35 as we calculated, there was no prime minister's visits. And obviously that allowed us to recognize a significant progress in bilateral relations. Let's proceed regional directions. As usual, we identify traditional regions. Here you can see that first for the 3 years we have a Baltic states as a single regional bloc. Previously we kept them isolated as the nations. Now we assess that together, and same as the North America, they are among the top nations in terms of the contacts, strategic communications, political interest. And for instance, speaking about political interest and engagement, Nordic states could be a leading example of a regional cooperation when quite a number of meetings and sessions and North Europe-Ukraine Forum with the presidential participation. That allows us not to provide the highest score only, but keep it relevant, full of results. What else do we have in terms of improvement? That's the Western Balkans. After some period of calmness in recent years, gained an improvements from year to year. This year it's the B mark, saying demonstrating the number of bilateral contacts with all the states of the region with the dominance of Albania, but because Albania was the lead nation in OSCE, the number of contacts been duplicated. But other states also had demonstrated a stable dialogue with Ukraine. And also we see improvement in Indo-Pacific region. We assess the region with an exclusion of India and Japan and China. There is a separate scores for these states, but what we spotted for this region, that's the enhancement of interparliamentary dialogue, participation of parliamentary delegation in ASEAN, bilateral contacts conducted by parliamentary teams. Before that, the Indo-Pacific area was not been recognized so far. Same happened to Latin America, where we saw the growth of contacts at parliamentary diplomacy dimension. Nevertheless, we have some misbalance. We see that some activities in some regions engagement is higher than a political interest. Following the briefs of the president or foreign minister or government program for 2024, we can see not many stresses on these regions. The main effort still been focused on European area, coalition of capabilities, peace formula. But first of all, we mean the military diplomacy here. But in terms of activities, and contacts, the relations been developed. Some received an additional push, like Latin America, and at the beginning of the year we saw the endorsement of the strategy for Latin America relations. We saw the communication strategy, so a clear, purposeful policy formulation has started towards that particular region. Let's proceed. Our international organizations, here in the recent 3 years, we see the stable picture. United Nations, as usual, gained the maximum score, although we assess all three representations, although the major part goes to Ukrainian representation to New York.
In its headquarters, but we've been working elsewhere as well, and we assess here the number of speeches, the number of statements, the number of comments that refer to the statutes of the UN. And here we talk not only about the security issues, but also humanitarian assistance and various standalone projects of UN agencies here in Ukraine, and how Ukraine was in the center of discussions in the UN. So it looks like a big puzzle picture with 2,000 pieces, but still we gave the highest marks there. We improved the situation with the Council of Europe a bit. It became better than last year for sure, despite all the limitations that this organization imposes, but still we can see Parliamentary Assembly delivering and the involvement of the Council of Europe in discussing compensation mechanisms, fairness, human rights, thus allowing us to give good marks to them. It's worth with OSCE, because we should recognize that Ukraine operates in light of the need to have consensus decisions, and because of Russia and Belarus, our possibilities and capacities are being limited in that organization. Now, our multilateral diplomacy. And on this slide you can see a diverse picture indeed. The best marks were given to those priorities where we can sense the highest political interests, like the peace formula, sanctions policy, and military diplomacy and public diplomacy of Ukraine. These are the areas where we observed quite substantial level of efforts on the part of the president, the ministers, the MPs, members of parliament. So we can see the involvement of all the branches of power in following on those areas. The lowest mark was given to non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, we have restricted their attention only to the operations of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, even though theoretically it should have included the North Korean topic, namely the cooperation with the Russian Federation, and in the countries of global South, Ukraine is viewed as one of the leaders of the non-proliferation effort. What else is happening and worth mentioning? Well, certain changes in the how to deal with Ukrainians living abroad, and whether Ukrainian citizens would be allowed to be citizens in other countries as well. And here, unfortunately, our marks here are not as high as we wished it to be. And finally, the economic diplomacy, which has been evolving at a steady pace year in, year out, regardless of what's happening at the world markets or what happens with dwindling Ukrainian economic capabilities. I don't want to go into the economic details here, but let me mention the biggest trading partners of Ukraine. So, top 5 of our trading partners in terms of commodities. Traditionally, we have Chinese People's Republic, we increased there, Poland, Germany, Turkey, and Italy. These are top 5 countries that in 2024 became the largest Ukrainian trading partners of commodities. As for Ukrainian exports, their sequence is different. It starts with Poland, then Spain, Germany, China, and Turkey. So here Spain is ranked in top 5, substituting Italy. Let me pause on this, otherwise I will have to retell you this whole text here, but we are very hopeful that you will read at least those chapters that would be of interest to you by yourselves. By the way, you can read it online in Ukrainian at our website, while next week it will be available in English, again at our website and in our office. So those of you who would like to get a copy in English, please talk to registration people or come to me during the coffee break, and we will arrange how to share the English versions of this publication again only next week. So I'm pausing here and give it back to our moderator of the next discussion, the Mr. Sergei Sidorenko, who is the editor of European Truth publication, Европейская правда. Also, I would like to invite here our panelists. Okay, let me invite them. First, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ms. Sergei Kislitsa, Lesya Vasylenko, the MP of the advisor to economic and cultural communications, Andrei Zablutsky, and our colleague, economist Irina Kosse from the Institute of Economic Research and Political Consultation. So it's working. Since we have more handheld mics, or should we pass a mic? Well, that's one of the jobs of the moderator, and hopefully moderators are the ones who are ready to share their mics. So, why we're here today with you at this panel discussion called How to Preserve the Old Diplomacy When the World Order Seems to be Crumbling. And, of course, what I want to start with is the position of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Well, there's a saying, what you do with a dead horse? Well, first of all, dismount it. So the old world order is something that could not be reanimated. So should we stay in the saddle and try to beat this dead horse? I'm not a great expert in horses, even though 30 years back I was learning horseback riding. But let's start by defining the world order we live in right now. So, whether we like to preserve the current world order because it's what? Sacred? Well, I'll be bold enough to make a cynical or even shocking statement, but for different reasons, the current world order, the way it exists now, is not satisfying neither to Ukraine nor to our enemies. The world order, the way it is now, is not satisfying to Ukraine because it was built after the end of World War II, and as a result, it failed to protect us against the aggression. Since this world order was developed by the US and the countries of the European democracies in Western Europe between 1945 and the early 20s of this century. So it also is not acceptable to Russian Federation, nor to China, nor to the current administration of the United States, as we all can see. So are we getting off that dead horse? No, not yet. Because when we talk about extreme toxicity in terms of the perception of the UN in the Ukrainian society, among our politicians and the experts, the best gift we can make to our enemies and opponents would be to turn our back to the UN, stop being its member, formally or informally, allowing our enemy to rule within the framework of this existing institution, which will keep existing at least for a while. So we cannot dismount the existing world order. The order that became the result of the last century's two world wars, and all it will take is for the whole global community to come together and just decide that we need a new world order, and that would be quite a substantial effort. And that's what our enemies want us to do now, turn our back to the existing framework and even step out of those frames. So we should dismount this whole horse altogether, right? Not only us. So yeah, it's a ruined world order, but it's still the world order. Well, you know, the way it existed so far, it was never romantic, fair, and democratic. There are so many myths, misperceptions, and our wishful thinking to see in the existing world order something that never existed there in the first place. Well, look at the UN as an example. We are all celebrating the day of signing the UN statutes in San Francisco in June. We celebrate October as the month when this statute became valid back in 1945. But we never state that being the main global order, world order platform, the UN was incepted in Yalta, 1945. So in its DNA, it has genes of not only two old politicians from Britain and US, but also the spawn of hell, Stalin. So it was never a fair world order. When Stalin came to Yalta, he clearly made his position to everyone. He made it clear to everyone. He said, I would not allow anyone to be the ruler of this world unless they are the winners of this war. So us and UK and US. Then they let China in. Then they let France in. And by the way, Winston Churchill, and I like this quote, and I use it in New York a lot. So let me quote him to you as well, who Winston Churchill was quoting Shakespeare, actually, the Titus Andronicus phrase, and he told to Stalin, the eagle allows small birds to chirp, being ignorant to their needs. If it wants, with one sway of his wing, he can stop all those birds chirping. So that was Shakespearean quote that Winston Churchill used, telling Joseph Stalin, look, don't you worry, we'll be the eagles of the new world order. So if we want to, with the shadow of our wings, all those small sparrows, all those little birds sitting in the General Assembly, well, but they're not sitting on the Security Council. And we can stop them chirping. Just like that. So let's not continue being disillusioned in the fact that the world order that existed until now was not ideal. And actually, we've been proactively involved in spreading those illusions ourselves. But then the experts of international law, my former classmate, Maryashka, the current chairperson of the parliamentary committee, still believe that there is the primacy of international law, that it's something sacred. But the way international law exists now, it only could be used when all the players, especially main players, play by the same rules. But the only region, no, there are two regions, I believe. I don't want to leave anybody out. So the international law still exists in Europe and Latin America. That has a great school of international law experts. Before I give the floor to Ms. Lesia, let me first point out why I love diplomacy, being enthralled of it. It's when we are not letting you know what we're going to be asking you about, but you already respond with a quote well prepared in advance. Again, let's get back to the foreign ministry's strategy and what to expect from this strategy in the years to come. We'll come to that later on. But first, let's listen to other panelists. Again, speaking about the foreign policy last year, this year, and in the coming years, parliamentary diplomacy becomes one of the cornerstones. And in our report, we have focused a lot on this vector. But my question to you is this. As an MP, what is your perception of priorities? Doesn't mean that those priorities are that of the whole parliament, but being the member of parliament, in light of parliamentary diplomacy, where we need to focus more in the years to come.
That is very multi-vector questions. I'll try to respond, but also keeping the discussion going on. When we speak about agenda, which, Sergei, you have compared with a dead horse, wars of dismounting, I would avail myself to digress from agenda which is not working at all. This is agenda which has been shaped based on absolutely correct, bright values, speaking or using the terminology of international legal frame, which is utilized in UN Charter and a whole number of other conventions and treaties. What's wrong with the aspiration of nations to coexist peacefully within their borders? What's wrong with respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of each other? Absolutely fair when it goes about aspirations to stop and prevent aggressions. Some aggressive appearances is absolutely correct, absolutely fair in written, to support the human rights and ensure the fundamental human rights, but these are to be ensured by the state and nations. What's that in international conventions and treaties written very nicely, but how do we make it happen? How do we achieve that? And this is a significant gap which leads us to a conclusion that in the given agenda, which has been shaped following the Second World War, there are also significant discrepancies. And coming back to Shakespeare, it looks like that today one eagle or several eagles can blow their wing and cross out all the statements, things put in written, and to prevent the world from development and put the world back in chaos of war and after effects of aggression, which we see. Coming back to Ukraine, what we faced with and seen some risks and anticipating similar risks by Baltic states or Nordic states or our neighbors in Europe, without a consolidated position of the world community, single nation cannot resist the aggression, especially if aggressor is 10 times more and stronger on the front line and taking the economic front, humanitarian front, cultural front. It's even bigger discrepancy. Speaking about parliamentary diplomacy and being reviewed since 2022, how the strategic narratives been modified. They were modified significantly. Back in 2022, we have just single mission to resist, to withstand by any means. And back then, those values and those principles became of significant use, the ones written in international charters and agreements, and of course the support from our European neighboring states, Western world, but that should be also included Canada, Australia, the states, how do I call them, the Western region, rather the Western mindset, those who are traditionally were strategic partners for Ukraine, helping us to withstand. Then, when Ukraine realized that we have to consolidate the world effort, the entire 2023 was dedicated to that strategic mission, to interact, to find commonalities with the nations of the global south, so-called Africa, Asia, Latin America, and attempts were made very significant on behalf of Parliament. It has been mentioned the Interparliamentary Union or Alliance, the world longest existing organization combining parliaments of the world nations together, a very critical organization. And back in time there was a Russian dominance there. US was not represented in it, so it was very challenging for Ukraine. But in 2023 the first vice speaker Alexander Kornienko joined the team, and that had enhanced Ukrainian diplomacy with the global south states. It was absolutely different level of the meetings, and the number of states engaged were increased, and those meetings gave us clarity that when we speak about values or we use some terminology from international legal documents, when we have to condemn aggressor and after effects of aggression, when we speak about humanitarian crisis or international human rights, that terminology not always was recognized by the global south states because they had absolutely different vector of the development. And 2023 2024, there were breaking years for defining the parliamentary diplomacy when we realized that the majority of the world nations are to be approached with absolutely different narratives than we talk to the Western world. And the key role has been played by international economic relations, trade relations with those states, and developing bilateral relations with the global south. Started with, with our political support, which may cost some economical benefits that we have from China and Russia today. So what Ukraine may offer us in alternative. And in 2024, to an extent, a strategy has been shaped for parliamentary diplomacy. The Western world nations, European nations, our transatlantic partners were engaged in a dialogue with the global south, promising and finding the ways to build up partnership triangles or sometimes a multi-angle relations between nations of a global south and Ukraine. So the strategy for 2025 again been modified largely due to the factor of the United States, which cannot be ignored, and there's a significant impact, enormous impact on a foreign policy. We see that Europe now faced with a coalition of the willing, recently founded, and I would say that in these years the great success of Ukrainian diplomacy, not only the parliament diplomacy, is that we finally learned to coordinate, to balance between all the layers of international diplomacy and operate in synergy. Before 2022, I have to state, unfortunately, it was not there. Now what Parliament does today at different interparliamentary platforms and bilateral parliamentary relations is fully coordinated with the Foreign Ministry and a set of other governmental departments, including a civil society and NGOs and even local authorities, which to some extent, in some cases, have very strong relations with their counterparts abroad. That coordination goes without the party belongings, absolutely independent from party relocations. I can give you an example of MPs engagements from People's Servant Party, who were very successful, and also from opposition. I'm a member of parliament from Golos, from the Voice Party. I have nothing to complain at. I am the member and I'm represented in several interparliamentary delegations. I lead the branch of cooperation with United Kingdom, and I'm going to become a co-chair on the France cooperation. So the work is there. If you wish, if you have sort of a talent, if you can be useful at international engagement arena, the opportunity is there to maintain the unity for the sake of the state. Thank you for that review. One idea which we will dwell on later, but I would like to invite Andriy with a very special question. When we speak about international foreign policy, quite often it is seen the relation of Ukraine with some external partners. That's logic. Foreign policy, foreign partners, but communication, as I see it, should encompass other directions and elements. So speaking about the Ministry of Culture and Strategic Communications, in that sense, for me as a journalist, I am more affiliated to the second part of communication. I think some internal communications, when we have to explain to Ukrainian society what is foreign policy and what we would like to achieve in it, is not less important than foreign international communication. I don't insist that my view is absolutely correct or match the ministerial approach, but whether is it fair or you have a different view. Thank you. I will get back to the beginning of a discussion. So the horse riding issue is still there. Speaking of understanding the world order now, I would divide that the existing world order and our perception. The world order exists daily, and ruining happens to our perception of the ways the things been sorted. So can you dismount your own perception? It's very questionable. I think in that dimension the question is relatively relevant, but we may say that because there is a real world and our perception of this real world and our view of the perfect world, some things and sometimes our view being codified by international law or national law, that's the different layers. But if you try and raise over these layers, the cultural layer is something that modify your perception. These are probably the tools to manage and shaping the perception of reality. And coming back to your question on the Ministry of Culture and Strategic Communications, with the new team coming to office and reshaping the ministry, we got the view, we got the vision, we got a team that combines culture and strategic communications, like almost the entire new team have a foreign ministry background. We have DNA, which makes us very affiliated to foreign relations. But speaking that the Ministry of Culture has 3 functions in the realm of strategic communications: maintain, development and promotion of culture during the war. These became very critical to maintain things that been ruined physically, that has been ruined psychologically by psyops, but that's the constant cultural pressure. That's probably our front line, which we deal with daily, and at the same time to be able to develop the culture, to contribute to the development of the culture. And the war is not the best time for culture development, for engineering, for science. Obviously, that stimulates any nation for the development. And accordingly, we bear the function, in that sense, for us, for the ministry. By definition, every ministry is the agency that shapes the policy in a respective area. So accordingly, to shape the vision, to shape policies, from my understanding as an advisor on strategic communications, how to use culture in our external and internal communications as the cornerstone or as a tool. It's in a proper word to be applied to the culture, but culture can be a very powerful tool. We have an enormous layer of culture, we have number of cultural products, and we can communicate worldwide at emotional narratives. And for many layers of perception, it's far more critical than direct formal communication. If we will manage to create a proper emotional background, we will contribute to a proper perception of Ukraine through emotions, setting up connections and relations, and that would be a baseline and ground for rational formal communication through MFA, through parliamentary diplomacy. I have not forgotten your question. I'm not digressing too much, speaking about internal communication. Again, by its functionality, ministry is responsible for media development and so forth, but also there are many other agencies set by constitution like state TV and broadcast agency, where we play more coordination role as the ministry. And speaking about the communication element, because we have quite an unpleasant heritage of destroying the Ukrainian culture layer during the Soviet dominance, taking away Shevchenko books or excluding other Ukrainian artists from Ukrainian culture. We still have an enormous task to highlight and to channel inside of Ukrainian culture for all wider ranges of population, sorry for that bureaucratic language. So in terms of external communication, so it would take place not only by those who were nominated, but that should be implemented by each and every one, again, based on a Ukrainian highlighted authenticity. In many cases, except few subject matter experts, we have absolutely improper perception of Poltava battle, who was fighting whom, who had resources, is absolutely misleading. Or what is the heritage of Kievan Rus? What had happened back then? We have absolutely disgraced images of Petlura, Bandera, and that was part of a Soviet propaganda efforts. So definitely we should communicate internally, but through our improper perception of the world, that affects our principles. So looking at your DNA, how and what are the key tools and what are the opportunities and possibilities for the ministry to lead the strategic communications externally? Speaking about the Prism report, in the strategic communication chapter, it's more about messages that Ukrainian senior officials deliver. To my understanding, the ministry does not shape those narratives, so then what's your role in it?
Our role is not as proactive as we would like it to be, but at the same time we are still involved in some in-depth research of how we should use our cultural heritage and formulate and shape authentic messages stemming from the bottom of the heart of a person. And of course, we help our artists to communicate all the ideas that are truthful ideas needed to survive. We're not propaganda people. We are translating nothing but the truth. But from the standpoint of reinstating the cultural heritage, like Shedrik band that was still singing carols and traveling to other countries. So the minister himself and his staff are regulating quite a painful relationship with our Polish friends around the Volyn tragedy. So we're doing a lot as the ministry to shape such narratives. And for that, we can make use of many tools like the experts boards. Well, Prisma, please take note that next year, for each of our discussions next year, we need to add the cultural dimension, even though might be tough. Now, Miss Irina, let's talk about the economic component. So we're not forgetting about this dead horse that we need to dismount. But in the economics, this horse is still alive. So all the attempts to kill it by introducing all those tariffs, the horse is still alive and kicking. It's too early for its funeral, so the rules of international trade are still functioning globally. Any of your reflections on that first, but also I would like to hear your general impressions how our trade evolved last year, the year when the maritime corridor not only stabilized but starting actively exporting not only agricultural produce. So any reflections like that will be grateful to you. Before mentioning any figures, let me talk about your image of the dead horse. So for the economics, sticking to the global trading rules is important, but that's not the goal in and of itself, because the global trading rules help to trade, help other companies as well to find their niches and their sales markets. For Ukraine, currently, it's a sort of I'm trying to use the right image, like the turbulent ocean where nothing is clear and we need to navigate our way in this not very efficient but still a very important tool to bring hundreds plus countries together and discuss trading issues. I'm talking about WTO, of course. So, as for the last year's indicators, and Hannah mentioned our main trading partners, last year we still had quite a disbalance in terms of importing more than exporting. $70 billion is what we imported, and we exported only 42 billion. But still, imports increased 11%, exports almost by 16%. The share of exports to US shrinked. We started trading with other countries, especially in Asia. Poland, Spain, Germany, China, and Romania are our main exporting partners. And as for the commodities, well, foodstuff, agricultural products, metal, machines and equipment. And here we can observe the increase of exports by 21% for machines, transportation, vehicles, and thanks to the Ukrainian maritime corridor, where Ukraine now could not only export agricultural products but other commodities as well. What else we're trading in? Sunflower oil, corn, meat, chocolates, cookies, men's textiles. By the way, men's textiles increased by 646%. But the overall volumes are not that big, yeah, only $99 million. But when you grow, right? Who are the main importers? China, Germany, China is almost 15 billion, 14.4, and imports from China last year increased by 38%. As the result of this maritime corridor, I believe, allowing us to reinstate imports, because grain deal covered agricultural products, while imports came to us by land, railway or trucks. So when in 2024 the maritime corridor was launched full-fledged, then we started being able to import the commodities to meet the delayed demand. So we will bring exporting machines, equipment, chemicals, fertilizers, fuel and lubricants, gas, oil. Import of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, increased 3 times. The imports of accumulators doubled. Well, the reason is quite easy to understand. Blackouts as people to invest into generators and transformators. Their imports increased by 103%. In EU, our biggest trading partner is Poland, but compared to 2023, the situation almost never changed. While our exports to Spain increased by 64%, crops and sunflower oil there, and 46% increase to the Netherlands, mostly agricultural produce. Ukraine needs to diversify its sales markets, not only Europe, but Africa, Latin America, other continents. Room to improve their selling grain, steel, defense technologies. We need to be present not only in Europe, of course. And last year, the Asian countries were almost 27% of our general exports, Africa 6%, and Southern America only 3%. Now, the greatest increase was in Middle East, 25% increase compared to 2023. Sorry, my bad, that's not the biggest increase, 25% in Middle East, but Southern Eastern Asia, 36%, and 42% increase of other markets outside of EU, while the share of EU dropped because we started exporting more to other countries, to other continents. Well, I don't want to tell you again that it could be explained by a full-fledged functioning and operational maritime corridor allowing us to operate outside of Europe to China, India, and other countries. Well, some of the experts, I'm making an assumption here, that seem to be far off destinations. Usually it was re-export from Europe, right? Well, that's the subject of our discussions with the EU right now, because Poland was criticizing Ukraine by claiming that we have flooded their market with our products, something that was previously moving across Poland in transit, but then Polish farmers started blocking the border because some of those products were sold at the Polish market as well. So we need to clearly classify the products into such groups as commodities in transit or final destination exports. Before the maritime corridor was fully opened, whatever was exported to Romania, Poland, or other countries that have access to the sea, the lion's share remained in transit, only a small portion stayed in those countries. Okay, let's start with the next round of questions. And again, we need to beat this horse till the end, right? So what Lisa mentioned, this horse is lying down on the ground, but it's still kicking. Look at the US right now and how the kicks coming from US sends ripples across the globe. And this is a challenge not only for Ukraine, for all of the countries, but of course What we're discussing here today is Ukraine in the eye of the storm, so to speak. So, how could we build our strategy and our foreign affairs priorities in the time when the world is so volatile and when things are constantly evolving in the position of the US in all that? So, where should we be steadfast and where should we be more flexible? Let me start by saying that never in the world history we had a long stretch of time where things were stable and everything was looked through rosy-tinted glasses. The world was always in turbulence, but until 2014, those turbulences never affected Ukraine that much. But the world is in the state of permanent turbulence, and I personally believe that this turbulence gives us a chance, and this is an irony in and of itself, but why not reconsider some old, outdated positions without losing the integrity? We need to work on a daily basis, do what we need to do, and deliver. That's what Russians were doing, but they were constantly complaining by asking the whole world who is to be blamed. But that's not us. For us, the position is this. Every employee of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs should do their job at the highest quality level. Only when you did that, go to a coffee shop with your friends and discuss some philosophical issues. We have very clearly delineated red lines, and nothing would force us to let others cross those red lines. And those red lines is our sovereignty, our internationally acknowledged borders, it's our armed forces that would never become part of any deal, and finally our citizens, Ukrainians, and their safety. Whatever happens with the US in the nearest future, well, nobody knows. Well, if anybody among our audience or elsewhere in the world will tell me exactly how the US would look like in 2026, that's a person who sells you snake oil, because nobody knows what's going to happen, because this year US and by irony the Russian Federation now and in the next 380 days the final decision will be made by only one person. That's why we need to focus on doing our daily job. And when you enter the premises of the diplomatic academy, we all remember the words of the Minister Udovenko: professionalism, integrity, and respect to others. These are our signposts in our diplomacy, but also our strategic goals in protecting our sovereignty, protecting our armed forces. But speaking about the strategy, can we build it in the turbulent times like this? Wouldn't it be strategically more favorable to be ready not for strategic changes, but for tactical changes? Well, our strategy is set by the wishes of our people and our constitution. The constitution says membership in the EU, membership in the NATO. Everything else is situational. It's all about properly analyzing the way to achieve those two strategic goals. We made our civilizational choice, and our job is to make everything we can so that our current and former partners would not sway us away from those goals of membership in EU and NATO. Another question altogether, whether the EU by 2030, when we might become a member of the EU, would look like what it is now or not. The same is true for NATO. And that's why what's important is to involve Ukraine in all those discussions right now, even though we are not yet an full-fledged member of either EU or NATO. Well, what's your impression in the parliamentary diplomacy? Do we need to stick to some strategic plans that were approved, or since the world is in this state of permanent turbulence, but now in the heightened turbulence, so to what extent it's more preferable for us to stick to the strategy that we came up with years before, or is it better to become tactical?
There are two differences between strategy and tactics, things that enhance each other. And strategy should lead, for sure. In Ukraine, such strategy is available. It is in the constitution. We know what sort of Ukraine we would like to be. We would like to be a European state, part of European family, which we are part of. And we want to be a NATO member. We want to be in that security alliance, defensive, political, but first of all, we would like to be a state which has the whole full-fledged right to be represented in the international and legal aspect, in international political aspect, as any other independent political country. We would like that right to be respected. So our vision as a nation is there. Then the next, how do we achieve that? What should we do? What alliances and unions to be developed? Who are our friends in that process? Who are our strategic partners? What are the situative partners? And which nations are to be treated neutrally? Although, according to this neutral position, I personally would be very careful, because we see after effects and we still deal with after effects of such neutrality position from the diplomatic standpoint, or that's the position of sort of ego attitude. We see ourselves only, it's an ostrich position. Speaking about the global south, South Asia region, which appeared to be very interesting to us, even from economical standpoint and security dimension, African states, Latin American region, it is very difficult to us to shape a dialogue with them and build strong bilateral relations, because for years we were not paying such a critical attention to them, unlike European nations. Well, there were some objective reasons. Obviously, the states, upon gaining the independence, got so many challenges and not that much resources available to cope with those challenges. So we had to identify priorities, and those priorities were identified, and the focus has been given to EU and US. For many years, the priority for bilateral relations were relations with Russia and Belarus, who were seen not as a threat or a risk as an enemy, but as nations which are the most friendly and probably something more than just a strategic partners. And accordingly, somehow consider developing relations with global south. There was not that needed, because we expected that Russia will support us, every time, and we would be able to interact with or through the big brother. That was Ukraine's mistake, but we have what we have. Coming back to a tactical versus strategic, by achieving tactical objectives which could be adopted to the nowadays challenges or the ways the foreign policy is modified, we should keep in mind the strategy and a strategic direction. Where do we aspire to get to and at which state? It should not be there any support to Russian propaganda that says that Ukraine has no subjectivity and Ukraine is a dependable from United States and US to dictate and force us to do whatever they do. And we may replace US with any other nation. As of now, we have changed significantly. We got stronger as a state, as a nation, and we were enhanced in our understanding of our desired future. So we have clarity on whom and what we would like to be. So there is no suppression on that. We have a strong support. These are the nations close to us that are fully dedicated in their support, while we pay by lives of our people on the front line and in the far rear. And that's probably that support that allows us to defend and stand strict to our strategy and do not pay priorities to tactics. I would like to get back to Africa. The strategy of the European Union. Back in 1993, I was in a mission in Madrid in one of the sessions of European Council. We were not part of European Council back then. And the floor been taken by Estonian diplomat. And he said, "We're here for 2 days, but I have no clue what we are talking about, how that refers to our strategic objective of joining European Union. Why do I raise that? Ukraine, of course, is not Estonia by the size, by the population, but we do not have that possibility of spreading wide our efforts all over the entire spectrum of foreign policy. And for me, it is very critical from a professional standpoint to identify things that we have resources available, human, economic, financial, to meet the strategic objectives. We are not in that dynamic where we can allow some academic discussions in foreign policy or doing the process for the sake of the process. Africa, none of the blocs had a successful African policy except China. US has no successful policy towards Africa. 2 years ago, I met Charles Michel for some 2 hours. We spent an hour talking about Africa. EU has no successful African policy. We in Ukraine has no Africa subject matter experts. In all the wars, we had just one staff member of MFA with her PhD on Africa, and she had to go to St. Petersburg, to Leningrad, to find a second reader. We have no expertise on Africa here. Africa has a very profound interest, which our SMEs has no clue and cannot comment properly. Africa is transactional. You can enter once in Africa, or you may not be met if you have nothing in your hands. So our trade, our approach to African nations, to the global south, has to be reviewed. And we, by opening new embassies, we founded 10 installations also in Africa, despite limited resources, economical resources that we have. If you are not present physically on the ground, You cannot generate that expertise while you don't have SMEs in Ukraine to be successful in Africa. And finally, I have to say that up to now we don't hear the Global South. We hear ourselves only. Our experts speak about us, our media writes about us, and people dying only in Ukraine, and people suffer only in Ukraine. When at the beginning of the war I came to Yemen ambassador in New York and I said, Your Excellency, Ukrainian children are dying, and said, Your Excellency, I'm very sorry, you have my condolences, but what Ukraine did between 2015 and 2020, in Yemen, in war fighting, 11,000 children, Yemenis children, died. How many Ukrainian diplomats, members of parliament, SMEs and others, journalists, raised that? So, to be heard, to be shared by problems of people killed by Russians, we have to hear other nations, because other nations also survive conflicts. There are more than 50 ongoing conflicts in the world, and it was very dangerous for me as an ambassador of Ukraine recall other conflicts, because Ukrainian community immediately, Ukrainian experts and politicians were telling me, your case is not to speak about other conflicts. Your job is to raise Ukrainian conflict awareness. That's true, that's my responsibility. But we hardly can be successful not hearing others. I would echo, and probably you may agree, you see there is a support. We have to be conscious that this job cannot be expected that we start talking about that and result will come. We do need the result, but it is not working as such, and we should be ready that we will invest resources and efforts by globalizing Ukrainian discourse and Ukrainian narrative to get some benefit sometime later on, right? Before giving the floor to Andriy, I will mention that following this stage, which is going to be concluded soon, I would like to give some time for Q&A. So please highlight to me that there are questions and I will pass the microphone. So Andriy, keeping the subject of horse riding and the United States, how come that non-precedented turbulence taking place today in United States modifies our possibilities in cultural domain, in diplomatic domain? Do we have more opportunities or less? Once again, I'll get back to the beginning and quote Lao Tzu. Strategy without tactics is the slowest way to the victory, and tactics without strategy is the most resource-consuming way to defeat. So I don't understand how you can do things tactically if you have no strategic objectives, which goes beyond your existence. And in return, if you have a vision that we may call a strategy, you have a reference. And answering the question on turbulences, obviously the fragility of the world order, calling it a turbulence, it was expected and predictable. And now, in that period, when for the first time we entered the biggest turbulence in our life, the fight for its ontological existence and cultural existence, for us, it is the most opened window of opportunity for us as a nation through this enormously painful, bloody existential challenge. We create our own ontology. We demonstrate, we shape, we frame our identity in a cultural products, because these are very sensitive to such appearances. To some extent, it is the best period for Ukraine, for Ukrainian culture, for Ukrainian narrative, for Ukrainian ontology, that we were highlighted worldwide. And while we face this turbulence, first, we can become a leading example in Europe. It's great to live in a turbulence and demonstrate resistance, be resistant, and shape the required cultural context in the wider sense, not in the narrow as a cultural product, but culture as a social appearance. How the society should be shaped to withstand the attack, the assault of much stronger enemy, to withstand, to maintain its strategy, and now we may say probably the only nightlight that can set the foundations of the new world order that would follow this turbulence. What's going on with the United States and its role in the world? Is it enhancing our position in the world? Obviously, that there is an attention and appetite to Ukrainian culture, to Ukrainian worldwide. So our artists end up in exhibitions or shows that we could dream of previously. Would US context add anything to that? Well, it's difficult. Whether it ease or make it difficult, it's the question of good or bad. Now sits with those poets and artists saying it's ease. I hardly can say, because you face an existential challenge. You may disappear any moment, any given moment. Whether our killed and tortured artists, our painters, is it ease or difficulty? At the same time, it shapes absolutely new cultural layer that we are going to disseminate. Same goes to United States. When you end up in a situation of adulthood, because your imaginary adult that had to defend you appeared to be a child like you, it's a cultural challenge. And this is the challenge that caused some responses. We can't say it's easier for us or more difficult. It became more resource consuming, but this is endless pain and daily killing of people. We tolerate that to an extent now. You can't be constantly in the emotional funeral state, but this is the unconscious, terrifying horror. And this is an horror that we are on our own and we have to withstand. But we're not alone. We have brothers in arms from Europe who proves and confirms Ukrainian culture as an integral part and sometimes the foundation of the Western civilization. And what had happened to US demonstrates to us what sort of safe mechanisms, checks and balances to be introduced in society in a wider sense. I can't say it's good or bad, but this is a big resource and opportunity for us, that's for sure. Thank you, Irina. Continuing this domain, what's going on in United States changes rules and habits in trade, even if institutions are still there. we understand that the structure of the global trade is being reviewed now. Originally, in previous crises, Ukraine was among those who were suffering and who were losing the most among the world players. Do we have a chance to avoid this fate and become someone among those who can increase the world market presence? We do hope for that. Firstly, we do hope that sanctional pressure on Russia will continue and Russia would gradually be expelled from world markets, and that would be opportunity for us to take some niches which should become vacant after Russia withdrawal. So for Ukrainian manufacturers, these are new opportunities, and also I would like to reflect on the global south discussion. On my view, trade can also become one of the channels to set relations, in particular grain from Ukraine program. That's the humanitarian support from Ukraine, as in the previous years there were supplies of grain to Nigeria and to Sudan.
These are small size shipments, but it gives us a foot in the doorway to discuss further increases in shipments. Another thing in diplomacy that we haven't discussed just yet is how to agree about the needed investments to rebuild Ukraine. Ukraine is currently stepping away from the image of the country that needs help. We are starting presenting ourselves as the country that is ready to also offer something to the outside world. And so whenever the security and safety situation allows the international companies to enter the markets of our respective regions, please do to help us rebuild the country. But for that, we understand that we need to launch the programs that would provide needed incentives for this sort of diplomacy. Now, from the standpoint of what Ukraine has to expect looking forward, the current turbulence, will it bring only negatives to Ukraine or positives? Well, substituting Russia has nothing to do with US, but with the ongoing war. Well, if you look at the tariff imposed on Ukraine, it's the basic tariff, 10%. Compared to other countries, that's not that bad. But if you look at our level of trade with the US, it's insubstantial. So will our exporters lose a lot from those tariffs? They will, but not that much. I would not be able to operate with any more precise figures. Sorry. Look. I'm speaking not as a diplomat or first deputy minister, but as a citizen. Unfortunately, I don't see the needed level of expert discussion in Ukraine unless I don't know something, and correct me if I'm wrong. What should Ukrainian economy look like after the war is over? Not being an expert, I believe that the economics of Ukraine should not be the way it was before the war. So the goal of rebuilding the Ukrainian economy and its trade should not be rebuilding, repairing, and overhauling what's being ruined only. We need to offer a completely new economic model for various reasons, playing with tariffs, playing on the foodstuff market. This is all situational. And even if now, in theory, we can win some margin because we have 10 while others have 145%, that doesn't lead us into new strategic future. We need to present the completely brand new economic model. We should not rebuild those villages and towns and settlements that have been ruined and making them look again Soviet. We need to build the economy like in Canada, huge territory, minimal population. But here in our discussions, I constantly come across the discussion before the war we had this much millions of people, that many millions of people. Now we have less. No, sorry. This is the wrong algorithm of thinking. The right algorithm should sound like this. How could we build Canadian economy with what we have after the war is over? Well, let me side with economic analysts. And this discussion of whether we need to build the old economy or not, well, the consensus currently is we should not. But the discussion of what the new model should look like, well, that's where we don't have consensus just yet. Now, about the global prices at the global foods market. There is no lack of offer at this market. And the Ukrainian grain offer is not unique. The problem is the stability of the channels of food deliveries. The global problem is that agriculture and farming in this world could not operate without funding, state funding, and fertilizers. And unfortunately, Russia has this unique niche of supplying fertilizers. Everybody knew about that. Western countries, international organizations, World Food Organization, World Food Program, nobody did anything before the war started to diversify the production and supply of fertilizers to the global markets. And that's why the Russian Federation is manipulating and blackmailing the world. So let's be realistic. The Ukrainian agriculture is not our ticket into the bright future, unless we reform it, unless it becomes highly technological. In 2030, we would face tremendous water supply problems all across Ukraine. Not only drinking potable water, but the water used for agriculture. So in 2030, our agriculture, our farming would not be able to exist the way it is now. But we're still in an ongoing discussion how the agriculture should be in 2030 onwards. Well, we lack that discussion. I was ready to share one reflection, but now I have a few, thanks to the very interesting discussion. I will start with me reflecting on tactics and the general vision. Well, we have the general vision, but as for the strategies, well, we are forming them for each region. What works in Europe would not work in Africa, right? So, in addition to trade, what could we actually use, and we do? The environment and the climate change issues. This is the topic that opens a lot of doors when we want to build relations with small island countries, which, as weirdly as it sounds, are quite influential. When we want to foster contacts with Asia and Middle East, which is very interesting in this topic, and Africa to some extent. Africa, once again, looks at it through the grain from Ukraine standpoint. Yeah, the corridors of supply of grain are very important, but Ukraine will remain important because of the overall volumes of grain coming out of Ukraine. Well, again, Ukraine is in top 5 of global grain exporters. My idea is that for different topics we need to come up with different strategies, even though some of them might not be in the priority for this society. Like for the last 3 years, not only I was not only involved in international diplomacy, but I'm also a chairwoman of the Climate Change Committee. And I can tell you that much. I can build much better relations with non-European countries as a chairperson of that committee than as just a generic MP. Culture is also important. Religion is also the topic where it's easy for us to answer some of the European countries when we fail to get through to them, appealing to their economic, legal, human rights views, but religious is what helped us to get to the Greeks, because they have quite a strong position on what they can allow the Russian Navy to do. But even to start this discussion, we need initially to raise the issue of Moscow Patriarchy that is squeezing out Greek churches out of Africa, and thus they lend us attentive ear. This is the example of how we can reach our strategic goals by helping, in this case, Greeks to reach their religious strategic goals in other regions. After listening to Sergei, I wanted to add to the drawbacks of the current world order, and one of them is dependence from one country. Like Russia supplies fertilizers to the world, right? Or previously Russia was the only major supplier of gas to the EU, and Russia still remains a monopolist for certain natural resources, but that's not bad. The bad thing is that the world accepts this. Another monopolist right now is China. For many more components of military drones that have been used both by Ukraine and Russia. And this is the problem that goes outside Ukraine, because the world has recognized that UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, is not the future warfare, but it's the fact of the current warfare. Nordic countries, our European partners, are fast developing their own drone capabilities, and when we raise this with them, we ask them, where would you get components for your drones? And when we look at China, well, we're not sure that they're ready to spend more money from their budgets to produce the components that are currently manufactured by China. Thus, we are putting ourselves in the dependence from the country that is far from being reliable. These are the issues that need to be raised because they set a new vector of discussions happening at the international arena. The discussions that will, if not help to shape the new world order, but at least will help to shape the new military and economic alliances, but mostly economic. So how would the Ukrainian economy would look like after the war? A question that would require separate discussion for sure. But let's not forget about the issue of reparations. Ukraine has the right to demand to be paid reparations. Well, if you rely on international law as it is right now, and we need to find a way to achieve this. And again, for that we would require separate, narrow subject matter panel discussion involving lots of international experts, but believe me or not, reparations might play a great role in rebuilding Ukraine after the war. As for rebuilding Ukraine and its economic model after the victory, of course, we will not rebuild it 100% as it used to be. We will use the rebuild better principle, adding energy efficiency, energy saving, inclusivity, and other aspects. We don't need that many schools or hospitals or other institutions. It could be all streamlined. But as for the way the economy operates, I'm the economist. I look at the demand and the offer, and I know for sure that the market will know what it demands. And when you think about what international partners you need to involve for rebuilding, well, they are already involved to rebuild, for instance, the plant that was manufacturing glass. This plant was ruined, damaged, and look, every shelling, every missile attack brings windows glass down. Next, high quality paper used to print books, another plant that was destroyed. Now, agriculture depends not only on fertilizers, but also seeds. The seeds that we import and we depend on. And we treat that as the opportunity for additional investments into Ukraine by creating not only institutional conditions for them, but also insurance. Because for the businesses that would enter this market will have to be insured by international companies. By raise of hands, who would like to ask the question? You first. Hello, Oleg Dunda. Thank you for your responses so far and your keynote speeches. Well, we are not only not discussing the economy after the war, but we're not even discussing the wartime economy. Well, that's my reflection on your previous discussion. Now, 3 questions for different speakers. Question to Sergey. NATO and EU. I talk a lot to our colleagues, officials in both NATO and EU. And let me tell you that much. These are 2 organizations in crisis. They lack leadership, they lack understanding what's gonna happen in the future, but most importantly, inside, they have too many contradictions between the members, and in the judging on what happened in the last 3 years, those disagreements will only deepen. And then the question to Ukraine, to our foreign ministry, and to our diplomatic efforts. Shouldn't we become the leader of the discussion how to change those 2 organizations, since they lack this leaderships and they're not ready to initiate this discussion themselves? And this is the question to Sergey. The question to Ms. Alessia. We talked about global south, right? And we said that we need to change the way the world operates. Yeah, I agree with that completely. Whatever's happening now, they're very commercial. And we cannot compete with Moscow here, because they have by order of magnitude more resources. And if we cannot compete here, then what other tools should we find? Not religion, not culture. Sorry to mention this, because it's all about the economy. For the last 2 years, we are working with the global south, and the result is zero. Shouldn't we start with the military component first, probably? Probably that's the way in to the needs of the global south, not what we've been promoting over the last 3 years. And the last question to Irina. On EU, you mentioned that in Spain, in regard of Spain, we increase the exports to them, but in the next couple of months, they will change. The EU will change its trading policy to Ukraine. Are we ready for that?
To what extent is going to be changed? Well, they officially stated that already. Well, we don't know. That's the fact. They said, but what exactly are these changes going to be and how that is going to affect? Well, it's very easy and very simple answer to that question, because Ukraine today has a unique reputation that allows Ukraine to be the member of a discussion in Brussels with NATO, with the EU, at a level which we never ever dreamed before 2022, and not being formally neither NATO nor EU member. It's a different task here. How, after the war, whether it would be a peace deal reached or if that is going to be a stable ceasefire, how not to lose that reputation. Because I do believe that by its magnitude of challenges, a post-war period is going to be not less challenging than the war period, because very quickly we may lose that political capital that because of these tragic events we generated, unless we get back to an active phase of Ukrainian cannibalism, when political parties, for the sake of the election victories, will beat heavily each other, and internal political discussion will undermine our strategic aspirations towards NATO and EU, where there are quite many nations that quietly will be happy that Ukrainians, without their contribution, would digress from their strategic route. So we have reputation, we have authority, we have to respect current gains. EU has profound problems, but EU is able to evolutionate. And that's what we can witness now. Thank you. I really enjoy discussions on Global South. That's absolutely different world, absolutely different dimension, different everything. What makes me happy in this sense that there is a common understanding that you should not be isolated and stay away from the entire planet. So we have to invest, and we do have to invest in these relations. This is a long and delay investment. We mentioned that during the panel. It's not going to happen that you introduce fewer embassies, you pay few calls or bilateral visits, and here you go, there is a change of attitude towards Ukraine, or we are the best friends to Asia. No, that is not going to happen. Africa directly says, we're not interested, we enjoy Russia and China, and you have nothing to offer us. Asia is absolutely different. Asia would say, well, we do emphasize you, we sympathize you, but from the Buddha mindset, let's do something. But they would still say the same to Russians. So we have to be not being disillusioned, that we can enjoy this pleasant dreamland, which is going to be very painful when it faces reality. What to do? Keep working, search for resources, maybe seek for experts. Yes, it will take time, it will take effort, how we can optimize our way of developing relations with the world of Global South. That's through conversation and development of trilateral relations. Engage European nations, US, Canada, and much better through our Nordic partners, better through Australia and New Zealand, those nations who do not have a colonial heritage in their history among the Global South nations, and see the entry points and build in partnership with our strategic partners, those who would be willing to support us even financially, to enhance export, to arrange visits. It's not an easy thing to do, not in a way. You cannot do an online diplomacy, not in a way, especially when we speak, when we mean some nations having no representation of Ukraine, where no bilateral senior visits had happened. Those would require physical presence, and that should be a stable, continuous presence, and it's difficult. And my enormous thanks to Ukrainian Prism, who support us in finding resources to represent Ukraine, respectively by delegations on interparliamentary assemblies or on a bilateral dimension with nations of this kind. The subjectivity is very critical. I do echo my colleague Oleg, who said that we have to look at security and defense dimension. It is absolutely interesting to all African nations. And speaking of Africa as a transactional state, that's where they understand that this transaction in new technologies would be utilized, and it's better to do with Ukraine rather than defeat the enemy towards China or Russia, those who would have these ambitions to control African militaries. Ukraine has no ambitions of this sort. We are ready to operate transactionally, and God bless, we have something to offer. We have new technologies which were tested and been proven on the front line. We have know-how, not only technologies, but we can teach how to utilize and how to adapt to the real battlefield requirements. And we have to recognize that the elements of our post-war economy, that would be our military experience. So this would be our veterans, our ex-military, those who can train, conduct workshops, do the joint operations, peacekeeping operations. We have to keep that in mind, but I would not reject other areas which were mentioned. They are also interesting. And right behind the military domain, there is an educational sphere. Let's not forget that before 2022, I don't remember exact figures, but quite a large number of international students from India, from Africa, and from other global regions, and that education is something that is valued when we talk to African region. There is an appetite that we would like to restore the education. It would be probably impossible, but at least let's exchange some faculty staff members, send your experts to us or host ours for some deliveries, for some lectures. But that's education. That's a very long-lasting investment that opens some doors for Ukraine to an extent, but that also an opportunity that worked well for Russia. Are there any expectations? It's not only expectations. There are specific figures because it's a timely question set. We produced an analysis calculating what is going to be the impact of EU trade barriers, which are to be exhausted in June, and it means that we have to get back to the situation before, and before we had an agreement of free trade with EU setting the tariff quotas. And what are these tariff quotas? It means that certain group of goods, there was an amount set that could be exported without taxes. If that amount has been exceeded, then the tax would be applied. And we considered several scenarios. If we got back fully to the situation before this autonomous trade activities, Ukrainian annually would lose $1.5 billion of export, because when those restrictions were lifted, our exports in amount grew largely, and that would be a significant loss. The other option, to cancel everything, liberalize things, or to leave some special sensitive groups of goods with limits and less to be lifted, then obviously those losses are going to be less significant. But please have a look at the webpage of Institute of Political Studies and Political Consultations. The work is published there. Just passing the mic, just a quick critical remark. In many developed nations, export of cultural product makes some 50% of export as such. That's an interesting thought, how to rebuild the economy. The time is flying, but I saw there was a question in the second row, or third row. Would you please pass the mic? Thank you. Very briefly, Elena Doblikanova, Ebert Fund. We were speaking a lot that times are changing, narratives are changing. Ukraine, since 2022, had developed a whole range of efficient narratives, from economical, ethical, cultural, political, but keeping in mind what's going on in the White House, which is painting in gold very actively. What do you think would be the effective messages at this new stage of restoring Ukrainian-US relations? What should we say? What should we deliver to our American partners so our relations would become better, in a simple words? Is it a question to Sergey? No, it's a question to all the panelists, if you have any ideas, but maybe to Sergey first. Is it about US only? Yes, only. How do we communicate with US? We're still dependent, the world is dependent, and maybe if we are more or less clear with European partners how to communicate to, we have our respective narratives generated. So whether old narratives are still usable or some new narratives to be developed, well, speak with respect. We have to respect each and every one, because despite all this hype that is taking place around the US, I am, being a person who lived 11 years in the US, I can assure you that US will stay the most critical, or one of the most critical cornerstones in the foundation of the democratic world and Western civilization. So it is critical to approach to the events in such a way that excludes emotional load, whatever emotions we would face. And it is very critical not to make mistakes. If someone counts days till the next election, it's 1,374 left. But I can assure you, firstly, it's more than the war goes so far. B, or second, let's consider that President Trump was elected by US people, and he's a politician elected by the people, and we have to respect that. A week before elections in US, we had a TV group from one of Ukrainian TV channels and said, we're going to go on the streets of New York to ask average Americans what they think about elections. And I said, there is nothing to look at New York. New York is not the United States. Manhattan is not the New York. Go to the Wild West, to Kansas, to Oklahoma, Alabama. There are communities and electors. These are American people. If you would look at the map of elections, neither New York, nor Chicago, but the entire US elected from the heartlands, Middle West, Middle East. So A, we have to treat with a respect American choice. B, we have to make lessons learned what happened to US, not knowing what US is, applying some templates or stereotypes, and we have to become adult, as well as Europe has to become adult. Europe has to get rid of such an ego way of living. People in Europe believe that their right for vocation is a Bible. You don't have to fight. In France, after Bastille, you can hit the road, whatever happens worldwide. In Italy, after 1500 hours, everything to be closed and siesta to start. Conflict prevention cell in OCSE came back in office in 2008 from leaves 2 weeks after Georgia had been seized and captured, because everyone was on leave, no one cared. You see, before we start pressing Americans whom they should elect and how they should live and how they should say, we should look at ourselves, generate lessons, become stronger with Europeans, and bear responsibility for our nowadays and for future, including the defense and security, more than we as Europeans did before. There are too many fakes, illusions and myths around NATO. What is NATO? What is Article 5? You see? So let's deal with analyzing ourselves, improving ourselves first, and then be critical towards United States. If I may just... I did not mean that we have to mentor someone or criticize. I asked how to be efficient in communicating with partners who are critical partners. This dialogue has not been changed. The dialogue is there. We're trying to make this dialogue a fundamental thing for us, for diplomats. There is no future, safe future and stable future without a transatlantic unity. We have to preserve the transatlantic unity. That's for the benefit of our opponents and opponents to get rid of this transatlantic unity. I'll echo briefly in terms of urgent changes in presenting Ukraine. Maybe that metaphor is not very tolerant. We are not in a tradition of patriarchy of 40-year-old female. We don't have to rebuild ourselves. We are not a failed state. We are the state as we are. It's not a Black Friday, it's not a grand sale that we have to redo our messages. We exist. We Ukraine. We withstand a terrible war for 3 years. We withstand 10 years under attack of culture, mental and informational pressure. We communicate Maybe we have to review some channels, but messages are not to be reviewed because we deserve to exist. On this optimistic point, I would suggest to conclude. I think we took 4 extra minutes. I think it was an interesting discussion, and I would like to give the floor to Hanna Shellis, and thank you, panelists, for an interesting discussion.
Дякую всім, хто був з нами.
Would like to thank all of those who are still with us here, and we're grateful to all the online viewers. But after having 2.5 hours of discussion, you're waiting for coffee. But first, great thanks to our speakers, our beautiful panelists who were able to get to dry mathematics figures their opinions. And I'm grateful to 40 authors who contributed to this year's annual report. So thank you, coffee and cookies, and please